Okay, welcome everyone to the Institute for Government in what feels like a new school term. So the last few months we've seen quite a lot of discussion about the possibility of hung parliament. That turned out to be very important. We talked a lot about minority and coalition government and how they might be different from the large majorities that we've been used to. A few of us also discussed, just on the off chance, the possibility of a small majority. But this event is our attempt to try and think in more detail about what this might mean for this current government. With what, against expectations, actually felt like a big win for David Cameron, it actually turns out he's got quite a small majority. And this has led us to need to think about what this might mean for how you govern in those sorts of circumstances. What does it mean for Parliament? What does it mean for government, the relationship between the two? So what is different? How do you govern in these circumstances? And also, what kind of lessons might we draw from history, but also what's not so relevant? What might be different this time round? With that in mind, I have a very good panel who have experience of all these different forms of government to bring to us. On my immediate right here, Baroness Taylor of Bolton was a government whip under James Callaghan in the 1970s as he went from a small majority to a minority government, and also shadow leader of the House of Commons during the major years, so experience of opposition then. Lord O'Donnell, former cabinet secretary, but for our purposes today, he also was press secretary to John Major during some of his more turbulent years. I should say John Major's more turbulent years, possibly not yours, I don't know. Yeah. And then to my left, Peter Riddell, for our purposes today, former Times journalist who has seen all of these periods of government, and referring to some of Peter's articles about the Tory rebels in the mid-1990s, John Major referred to Peter as always one of the more balanced observers. So take of that what you will. We'll start with Baroness Taylor, and then Lord O'Donnell, and then Peter. And then we will turn to you. A lot of experience in this room as well, so we're hoping to hear from all of you about what you think, what might be different, and so forth. We'll have about 5 or 10 minutes from each of the panellists, and then questions from the audience. Baroness Taylor.
Right. I should make it clear, I was a child at the time. I mean, I don't like going back all those years, and Peter remembers them as well. Yes. When it's tumultuous, it tends to be more interesting. Some of you may have seen a play that was the National Theatre last year, the year before, called This House, which is actually about the 1970s Labour government that went into a minority and how we kept the show on the road. I'm not going to go through what that says, but if ever you get the chance to see it or read it or whatever, it really is a fantastic piece of theatre. All the best, because it actually does touch on reality. But as I say, I'm not going to go through that all. I'm just going to try and give you several things that I think should be at the back of your mind when you're thinking about the next few years, and I think it will be a few years. The first thing I would say is rule number 1 in politics is always expect the unexpected. If anybody here today tells you exactly what is going to cause the government the biggest problem in the next few years, then I really think you shouldn't believe them. We will all pontificate, we'll all make suggestions, we all mention Europe, and there are some obvious things that are going to cause difficulties, civil liberties and all the rest of it, but there will be something that comes absolutely off stage and really does cause a problem that we haven't thought about. I was there, as was Jeff Rooker down there, in the Labour government in the 70s. I was one of the people who will still confess, I think there's probably only myself and David Owen, who will confess to saying to Jim Callaghan in the autumn of 78 that we would lose an election that autumn and therefore postpone it to the following year. It was a logical decision to postpone it to the following year. The economy was doing reasonable. There was a decent pay deal that was going to be on offer to trade unions, but it didn't happen because the trade unions decided otherwise. We had the winter of discontent, all that followed, and 13 years of Mrs. Thatcher. That shows that politicians can make absolutely, seriously logical decisions and things still get blown totally off course. And I think that John Major probably had that as well. So it's events. Secondly, don't get too excited about the fact that this is a small majority. It is a majority, but we do also have the Fixed Term Parliament Act, I'm sorry to say, because I think that that was one of the worst things that the last government did. A small majority brings pressures and brings potential problems, but it also brings lots of opportunities and lots of opportunities for excuses. I think that David Cameron used the coalition as an excuse quite a lot. He's been deprived of that, but I do also think that public expectations, at least at the beginning, and maybe only at the beginning, are tempered by the fact that the government only has a small majority, because somehow it's in the psyche that government is going to be a bit more difficult than it would. I think the government will get a relatively easy ride in the honeymoon period, however long that is, although I did see that Dominic Grieve was actually flexing his muscles on Human Rights Act today. So maybe it'll be a bit bumpier than it would be. Now, there are other issues that I think get mentioned, like, by-elections and how many have there been in each parliament. What you've got to remember is that we actually have relatively few by-elections. We usually don't get much change if you look back over history at by-elections. And we have a younger parliament than we had in the 70s, therefore you would expect fewer problems of that kind. And actually there could be a problem for the Labour opposition, with UKIP actually wanting a northern by-election to go after. So I think that that could be a problem on either side. The real potential for interest and excitement comes from the malcontents. Now, I've got a theory that everybody who's involved in politics has to be a malcontent, because if you were content, you wouldn't be involved. But in parliamentary terms, I'm talking about people like Jeff Rooker, who's sitting down there waiting to ask his questions as usual. And whipping always has to take on board the malcontents. There are rebels who come to Parliament as rebels and are never going to be anything else than rebels. There are others who come as rebels, get taken on, become a minister, get sacked, and then become a rebel again. So it's a variable definition of a group, I think. So you've got former ministers, you've got non-ministers, the disappointed, and you've got the neglected. And I think you've got to be very careful, especially in the present circumstances. The government will have to be very careful over those who feel that they are neglected, that other people are having too much say, because the egos in politics do tend to dominate, and they dominate internally as well as to the press. So I think you've got to make sure, in whipping terms, that you divide and rule, that you try to make it difficult for your various groups of rebels to coalesce around the same issue, particularly dangerous if they were to coalesce around an issue that had some public resonance and some support. So at some stage people will get to discussing the EU referendum. We are seeing some beginnings of people wanting to work out, you know, how's that going to be? Is Farage going to lead the Out campaign? Well, Carswell says no, and then who was it who was saying no today? John Redwood was entering into it and saying, you know, we can't let UKIP lead the no campaign. So there's going to be some interesting tensions. But Harold Wilson went through that, and certainly so far as government ministers were concerned, his solution was quite obvious and quite workable. It did leave some aftermath of problems and relationship issues, but nevertheless it got them through, or got us through, that referendum. The other thing you'll hear about is that the House of Lords is going to bring down the government any day and refuse all its legislation. That isn't going to happen. Look at the political arithmetic in the Lords and the crossbenchers. Crossbenchers tend to vote Conservative far more than Labour, and they don't like to defeat the government very often. You know, if you've defeated the government 1 week, it's probably going to be a few weeks before you get another defeat. Now, there are opportunities on human rights issues, on civil liberties. There will be opportunities, but they won't be many, and I don't think that they will cause too much difficulty unless there is something that crops up. And that brings me back to the political arithmetic of the Commons. To defeat any legislation, to get amendments through, you have to have a majority. That means that all the opposition parties would have to be against something or for the same amendment. Are you going to get agreement there? Are the Irish always going to vote with the government or not vote at all, which gives them another majority? There's always, or there has been in the past, the opportunity for ambushes and some clever work. I have to say that seeing all the selfies last week, I don't think ambushes are going to get off the ground because everybody's announcing on Twitter what it is they're going to be doing in the next few hours. So I think that that's not going to happen. I think that a small majority will be more burdensome on ministers than the large majority. And in many respects, I think that's not a bad thing. It will curtail the way they can travel. It may stop them going to the odd EU meeting, which might not be a good thing. But I think it will mean that ministers will have to be in the House more, and I think that that will be good for the body politic. And I also think it means that they may be restrained in terms of what they try to do. I think that my biggest problem when I was Chief Whip in '97 was actually not the rebels, and people kept saying, is it Dennis Skinner or is it such body? No, the biggest problem you have as a Chief Whip, if you've got a big majority, is silly ministers who get obsessive and want to go off on a tangent and can't see the wood for the trees or the political realities and want to do really stupid things and think that you can get anything through the PLP. So I think that a big majority might restrain ministers, might make them more in touch with their own backbenchers, and that might help.
Yes.
Thank you. I have definitely had a feeling of deja vu during the last few days as I remember the '92 election. I was sitting inside Downing Street as John Major's press secretary, as was mentioned, and the exit polls came up, and as people will remember from that period, the exit polls were in fact wrong. They were badly wrong. So when I was this time round, this election, the exit polls came up, and I'm live on television, and I've had 30 seconds to look at the exit poll and decide what to say. Fortunately, I had spent the period between 1992 and 2015 actually looking at political modelling and understanding how good or bad the forecasters were, and I had, as a result of this, an enormously improved view about the quality of the exit poll. So basically when it came out, I said, that means David Cameron remains as Prime Minister, and it's just a question of how it's sorted out. So, whew, you know, it wasn't wrong. What I really thought, of course, is there goes all the sales of the Cabinet Manual. You know, it's disaster, really, but, and we would be talking about other things were it not for that. But when I consider, so we have a Prime Minister coming in unexpectedly won. There are some contrasts. When John Major won in '92, the number of seats in Scotland. How many seats did John Major have in Scotland? There's probably enough nerds in this room that actually know. And how many did he improve by then? Come on.
10 to 11.
It was 9 to 11, according to...
It was a by-election, that's right.
That's right, thank you.
I get the nerd prize, Gus.
You get the nerd prize brackets almost, yeah. It was 9 to 11, so kind of that was interesting. But in terms of what John Major perceived as the big issues, and you know, looking back on those days, my notes, preserving the Union, #1, actually. That was a huge issue. Scotland was an enormous issue. And John Major had campaigned against the advice of Conservative Central Office to devote a lot of time to the Union as an issue. And it paid off in the sense that they got more seats in Scotland. So he thought that was hugely important. And I suggest that for this government with a small majority, preserving the Union will be a massive issue as well. Secondly, Europe. We're facing Maastricht, and that was a big issue. And what he said in his memoirs, and let me quote, "From the moment I first crossed the threshold of number 10 as Prime Minister, I had dreaded the potential impact of Europe on the Conservative Party." So he knew the potential for Europe to tear his party apart. So that was from day one. And so that was a huge issue, how you manage that. Third thing was interesting, raising the standard of public services. Now, again, this wasn't at a time when there was a need to, and a commitment to cut the deficit from 5% of GDP down to 0. So he was talking about how to actually change the culture of provision of public services so that they were much more customer-centric, and all of those things which are much derided by the press of the time, as Peter I'm sure will pick up, like Citizens' Charter, which are now kind of the basics of how you do public service reform, i.e. you care about the public in this more than anything. And then of course there was the economy. Issues for John Major were great difficulties about how you managed the economy, first of all on public spending. Remember, one of the first things he did was set an overall envelope for public spending, 92, first time. So there was a big change there. And secondly, managing how you actually ran macroeconomic policy. So the whole ERM debacle, then the move to inflation targeting and all the rest of it. So big, as Anne said, you know, big external shocks come along, and they're not that you'd expected them on day one, but they're there. So fast forward to 2015, preserving the union, devolution and all that will be a huge issue. The first big piece of legislation, devolution not just to Scotland, we should remember various commitments on Wales and Northern Ireland as well, but you've seen what the SNP will do, and we can predict this kind of almost, sorry, shouldn't say anything about our ability to predict anymore, but I think we can see where Nicola Sturgeon is going to come from in terms of what emerged as the briefing. As a former press secretary, you can kind of read between the lines, the briefing of the meeting with David Cameron. It's going to be, as a result of our force in Westminster, we achieved significant gains for the people of Scotland by getting these extra powers. We didn't get these extra powers because we haven't got independence. So win-win, right? We've won a bit by being here, we'll win even more if you give us independence. And that's kind of been the history of the way the Scots have played the deal, and they play it really well. You know, they're very, very skillful at it. So I expect that. Europe, coming to that referendum, I think everyone's now realizing that Europe and the Union kind of come together. In fact, there's a lot of people now saying, well, if you lose the European referendum, Brexit, that leads to Skexit, so Scotland leaves the Union, which I think most people would accept. And the third part that's now being added to that leads to the breakup of the Conservative Party. Now, interesting question as to whether that necessarily follows. But you can imagine a political realignment post, and for all the major parties, post an independence referendum and post us leaving the EU. And one thing that I think we should remember, so let's say we vote to come out. In the old days, I would have thought it's a referendum. These are really, we've asked the people. So once you've had a referendum, that's it. Actually, we just had a referendum in the last Parliament on the voting system. I haven't noticed that that was it. I have noticed quite a lot of people saying this voting system is deeply flawed. UKIP, the Greens, Conservatives did incredibly well out of this voting system. So, you know, you could look at it from all sorts of sides. The second referendum, of course, on Scotland. Now, obviously, that settled things forever. So there is this kind of naive view, we have a referendum on Europe, and that solves things. And then, you know, the answer's the answer, and then it goes away. Well, it doesn't, I would predict. I don't think that either party will accept this and go away. I think a referendum as a kind of defining moment that puts an issue away for a very long time, I'm afraid I don't buy that anymore. I used to, but I don't. So that's, I think, very big. The public services area is going to be huge because they're going to have to improve public services at the same time that demands are going to be growing because of aging populations and the rest. The question about do you carry on squeezing public sector pay and what are the detrimental impacts of that? And how do you know, the cuts on the unprotected departments are going to be quite huge, and that's going to be serious. And there's also, I think, on the economy going to be a massive debate about productivity. My rules for operating, and this picks up what Anne was saying. Let's go through. I have 4 rules for operating with small majorities, which I kind of had blazoned into me during those years. The first one is pick your battles, because there are lots of things. Anne was saying there are ministers that come to you with pieces of legislation. The bids for the Queen's speech are this long, and you're saying, guys, look, don't, you know, why do you need this piece of legislation? What difference is this going to make? Is this going to be significant? Are there other ways of doing it? So if I was there, I would take the Queen's speech, and if I was as Cabinet Secretary now, I'd be putting a line through half of the stuff that's in there, just saying, find another way. Because if you are going to have legislation, you want it to be the right issues. Now, there'll be some issues where you know you're going to lose. That's fine. That may well be tactically what you want. But you have to have picked the issues that you want to win and pick the issues you want to lose. Secondly, and pick this up, maintaining party unity. There's only so much you can do. But I remember it's basically carrots and sticks. When you think about all those advantages from being in government, you know, the fact that you've got checkers, that you can do all sorts of things, you can invite the MPs into Downing Street, have receptions, find ways to make them feel that being a part of government is really good. And as you said, the issue about reshuffles, you know, probably the irreconcilables, there's a group of irreconcilables, but one that I found was really, really irreconcilable are the former ministers, the sacked, because there's no possibility really that they're coming back. So they're difficult. You have got a number of irreconcilables, and I'm being very careful not to use the B word here, but their parentage is frequently questioned, who are tricky, and some who just, I mean, I have a number of people have said to me that the conditions for renegotiation for David Cameron from the Conservative side are A, B, C, and D is whatever can't be negotiated. Right? So there's a group that are absolutely clear there is no renegotiation that matters. And there's also a group of businessmen who are saying, actually the point about EU entry in or out is a massive point. The renegotiation is a very small element of it. So actually we strongly believe that we should be in the EU, and some others strongly believe we should be out of it, and the renegotiation is really somewhat marginal. So there'll be a realpolitik of a lot of people thinking that, but obviously it's a question of how many will be allowed to say it. So maintaining party unity, carrots and sticks, and your stick is the chief whip. You need a really, really good chief whip, because they manage things in ways you don't want to know, but they manage them. Third thing I'd say is, again, Anne mentioned this, divide and conquer. The idea that you've only got a small majority, exactly as you said, that's if they all line up against you. And there are great advantages in forcing them to all line up against you. You know, there's some suggestions I've been reading today about why doesn't David Cameron ask Alex Salmond to go on some of the renegotiation sessions with him? Drag him into the Europe renegotiation debate. That would be quite interesting. It would be quite interesting for Salmond to see what he would say about that. So I think there are interesting ways you can divide and conquer. And my fourth rule was, don't forget the Lords, because if you think about the issues that are going to come up, yes, there is, Anne's absolutely right, we've had plenty of times where government have had a minority position in the Lords from 1997 onwards, I think, massive minority. Similarly massive minority now. That doesn't matter. The Lords are very careful about being the refreshing and all the rest of it. However, if you look at what's going to happen, devolution, very constitutional. Human Rights Act, very constitutional. Boundaries, possibly, very constitutional, very political. Europe referendum, very constitutional. So there's lots of things where the Lords will actually feel that it is their job to get involved. And the question is, you know, how much of these are covered by manifestos and all the, you know, Sewell Convention and the like will come into play. So I think it could be a very interesting time. And the final thing, of course, to say is external events. There are things that we haven't mentioned that will come along which will create threats and opportunities. And the one big difference, Anne did mention, was Fixed Term Parliaments Act, so that this time round the government can't get to a situation where for a brief period everything's looking rosy and then boom, we'll go for a new election. You imagine win the EU referendum and our future in Europe is cemented by David Cameron. David Cameron then says, okay, I've done my bit, I'll hand over to X, and then X says I'm going to have a general election. Actually, can't do that anymore. But you can imagine the circumstance, given that the predictions are the economy is going to carry on growing, although, as a number of people have said to me, recession is one of those external events that's quite possible, and we're not very poor at predicting recessions, so that's worth thinking about. So all in all, interesting times.
Thank you, Gus. Peter, what are your balanced observations this time round?
As a super nerd, yeah. I do remember to save Gus's blushes. I think one of the last couple of times we talked in the last few months, and I think from this platform, he did say, remember there's a 10 or 15% chance that there'll be a raw majority, based on his modelling. So that was there then. One thing, I just want to go through some thoughts about how it's different in that in the situation we are now. I think there's a kind of learning process for the civil service. Just as last time the civil service had to adjust to a coalition and they were beginning to think, how do we deal with a minority government? I think the biggest adjustment this time is the fact there isn't a coalition. And I think one of the most interesting things psychologically, and I've been picking this up in Whitehall last week, is the sense of one party governing is almost as significant as the majority point in change in behaviour. No quad. Actually, arguably, quad's rather a good idea, but no quad. I'm sure we'll see a much more simplified cabinet committee structure, a much more simplified communication structure, and I think therefore the ethos of Whitehall will be very different. And the majority element is almost secondary to that. And I think that will produce changes in behaviour, which has some problems in, which I'll come to at the end. And also the element of continuity is a very interesting aspect, because what we haven't had, normally second-term governments, and the interesting question is this a second-term or a first-term government? I was talking about this with my colleagues earlier today. This is the time when they do changes in machinery of government. This is when they innovate. This happened with Thatcher in 83. It happened with Tony Blair in 01 when he set up lots and lots of units internally, and there were changes in machinery of government. There's been nothing. Absolutely nothing. Very interesting contrast. And it's almost as if, well, we got an overall majority, we just carry on. And the business as usual thing, I think, is deceptive, but it is curious. 15 cabinet ministers doing the same job as they were doing 2 months ago, which is extraordinary. Even if you hadn't had the 5 Lib Dems pulling out, it's still a very large measure of continuity. One of the reasons for that is I think we are going to look at a parliament of 2 halves up to the European referendum and afterwards. Particularly, as David Cameron has said, he won't be fighting the next election. Whether he regrets that or not, it's not a matter. Just a few observations tying in exactly with what Anne and Gus said. I totally endorse what Anne said about The House, which is a brilliant play. And the only thing is it made Michael Cox, the Chief Whip, look far nicer than he actually was. But he got a flavour to it brilliantly. First point is, what does the majority mean? Everyone focuses on the dozen. The key point is it's 99 over Labour. And as has been said, it requires all the other parties to line up. And you look at the combinations that will occur, it won't be many when that happens. And also, it requires rebels on the government side. That may happen some of the time, and it may happen on some issues. So I think the other point is, I think this government's going to be, certainly for the first couple of years, apart from Europe, apart from human rights, as both Anne and Gus said, pretty okay on most bits of legislation. Because it requires, I mean, we don't know how the SNP are going to vote on English-only matters, and they may play it differently. We'll see on that. And I agree, I think it'll be pretty clearly signalled. But on lots and lots of issues, the government's going to have big majorities, and we'll have a rather comfortable time. And if you look back, actually, what happened between 92 and 97, everyone remembers Europe and perhaps Royal Mail privatisation not going through. They forget that the most contentious bit of privatisation went through, which is railways. And actually, the legislative record was quite controversial, at least until the last year or so, when the major government lost its majority. I mean, when you moved on, Gus. But certainly, a lot of pretty heavy legislation got through in that period. So it's wrong to think that you can't necessarily do things which are contentious. The other point I'd make is is how much does not involve Parliament. I mean, already there was quite a lot of work going on in Whitehall to look at what might happen if there was a minority government, what didn't involve Parliament directly. There's an awful lot of government which doesn't involve Parliament. If you look at what actually Alex Salmond, he's the actual expert on that, from the 07 to 11 SNP minority government, they did an awful lot outside, not involving Holyrood. I mean, within Holyrood, they moved by consensus, they moved by deal making with various groups, but they did an awful lot which didn't require Holyrood. Exactly the same happens at Westminster. One, because quite a lot of things happening now are implementing and taking forward legislation passed in the last Parliament in a whole range of areas. Schools, health, universal credit does not require new legislation, it requires getting right. Big challenge, clearly. All those things don't require coming back to Parliament apart from reporting, and the same applies in lots of other areas. So I think one can exaggerate the parliamentary point on that. There are also areas where the government acts indirectly, where again, Parliament isn't necessarily involved. I mean, Gus mentioned spending review. Parliament's hardly involved in spending, really. So the key actions there are much more the battles are going to be between the Treasury and spending departments, rather than necessarily involving the Parliament very much on that. I think that is crucial when one looks at what happens. Now, for civil service, I think it's right to say there will be more focus on Parliament. I think at times, but only occasionally, only occasionally, ministers will be spending more time in Parliament than they would otherwise have done. But it's not going to be all the time. It's going to be occasionally. I'm sure at times on Europe, I'm sure at times on human rights, I'm sure at times on devolution, where it'll be very interesting to see how that's played. My hunch is that the SNP have been studying what the Irish nationalists did from the 1880s onwards, where they caused a lot of problems for successive unionist and liberal governments up to the First World War, with disruption. And remember, Alex Salmond first made his name by being disruptive MP. I remember sitting in the press gallery when he interrupted a budget speech. In 1988, when Nigel Lawson had announced a cut in the top marginal rate from 60%, as it was for most of the Thatcher era, people tend to forget that, down to 40%, Salmond interrupted and the House had to be suspended, because that was his way of attracting attention when he was one of a tiny handful of SNP MPs. I fancy maybe doing one or two lessons in parliamentary disruption. I mean, we'll see what happens. But that may demand the presence of ministers much more. And a final point I'd make is exactly as Anne said, the danger of prediction. In 1959, after the Tories won for the third time, learned writers produced articles, and there was a book, Must Labour Lose? The underlying theme was that Labour was condemned forever to lose and could never win again. Exactly the same happened in 1992, and I remember going to conferences at the time that Labour couldn't possibly ever win again. We were in a one-party state, and it was followed by the biggest Labour victory ever. I think it's more difficult this time. The starting point for Labour is way behind where Labour was under Neil Kinnock in 1992 in percentage terms and in seat terms. It's a much more difficult position Labour's in now, and clearly with the Liberal Democrats going back to the position of the 1970s, or actually worse than that, they're back in the position of the 50s and 60s in share of the vote. It's a very different position, but the real dangers in determinism in these things. Also, and this is a curious final point on the paradox of the unexpected victory, hubris. There's always a slight tendency to believe, and the warning, I mean, if I was David Cameron, I would have someone around him, as Roman emperors did, whispering in his ear. just be careful, be careful. I mean, I noticed Steve Hilton has returned to publicise an interesting and different book about politics. Someone like that to just be whispering in your ear about the dangers of things going wrong. Because I think that the danger I would predict for the government is to believe that with the opposition in disarray and taking a long time to recover, which clearly is self-evidently true, they can have it all their own way. They're unconstrained by the Lib Dems. I think they overdid the constraints of the Lib Dems, but they feel unconstrained by the Lib Dems and almost a sense of one party for a time. That is a very dangerous thing because that's when mistakes get made. That's when governments make mistakes. And regardless of the nominal parliamentary majority, that could be a time when, quite unintentionally, governments trip up. So I agree entirely. Interesting times, and all the people predicting what will happen in 2020 are certain to be as wrong as many of us were a month ago.
Thank you, Peter. Okay, I'm going to take the chair's prerogative and ask a couple of questions myself. First one, a short one, not wanting to force predictions out of you, but I will anyway. We've mentioned the Fixed Term Parliaments Act a couple of times. I mean, what's the likelihood it will get reformed or repealed? Is that possibly a solution to Cameron being able to use that honeymoon period and possibly an improved economy to change it? That's my first question. The second one, just reacting partly to what Peter said, but also what Anne said about picking your battles. Peter, the way you've described how the civil service can work and the way we've all described how Parliament could act, yes, there's those potentials for both to be effective, but how can they be effective together? How much does the civil service, not just thinking about ministers' time and how much of that needs to be spent in Parliament, but how differently might it be able to operate to look strategically across government, thinking about legislation and the best way forward? What kind of changes to organisation might help improve in that way? And Anne, in particular, I mean, in your time, what were the links in? Was it just through ministers, and was the thought of the civil service just completely absent because you were thinking about just getting it through Parliament? I'll come to you first, Anne.
Come to me first. Well, can I do the Fixed Term Parliament Act one, and then we'll come back to some of the others. I mean, the Fixed Term Parliament Act is there. I don't think that David Cameron or many people in the Conservative Party want to home in on issues like that. I mean, last week's 1922 committee, there was discussion about whether to ditch Bercow or have an attempt to, and it was, we're not doing things like that at the moment, and I don't think they want to do much to do with Parliament. My colleague Bruce Grocott, Lord Grocott, has a private member's bill which he registered before we rose to be one of the first bills back in the Lords as a private member's bill. I think it's got that much chance, but it will raise the issue very nicely. And I think we've got to get people thinking about this, or whether we could perhaps amend the Fixed Term Parliament Act to clarify the circumstances in which the change of government could happen. It is actually possible. I mean, you've got to be careful about how you do it or how you sell it, but it would be possible for a government to bring itself down, to decide after a European referendum, presumably after our presidency, which will be just after the referendum, but to say, well, look, things have changed so much, there's so much uncertainty, or especially if we came out of Europe, there's so much uncertainty, we need a mandate to have 5 years stability to deal with X problem or whatever. So, the government itself could table the motion that this House has no confidence in a government. They'd have to sell it as a mechanism for getting the election. If they did that, the opposition can't oppose it. So the two-thirds majority, the majority would be there. So I don't think the Conservatives want to home in on it, but, you could do it.
What, on the two-thirds? They would have to get two-thirds of the whole House.
Yeah.
We're going wonderfully. That you allow a motion of no confidence to be passed, knowing that the subsequent confidence motion will not be carried.
Yes.
You vote against it. That's more likely. It's the 14-day thing.
Yeah, you generate it, and
I think they'd have to do it through the 14-day. The two-thirds is too difficult.
Well, I think they can.
Anyway,
an opposition couldn't refuse it, but it could happen. But it would have to be very peculiar circumstances. You might get a minor amendment to clarify all of those things in, but I don't think they're obsessing about that. They just think 5 years, we'll take it.
Mm. Yeah, my guess is they'll go with the 5 years. But it's a guess, you know, and you could amend it, and there are aspects of it. I think there are aspects of that and aspects of the whole constitutional setup, which I think the run-up to this last election kind of really brought out, and some of those areas in the Cabinet Manual that are wonderfully vague. It would be really good if someone actually started to list those questions, start to say, well, what about sorting some of these out?
We've done so a couple of times.
Indeed you have, and my expectation is approximately zero that anyone will do any of those things, but we missed the bullet. Things could have got really difficult if some things had worked out that way. Do you want me to answer on the stability? I think it's I think it's fantastic that we've kept so many ministers in the same place. You know, that they'll actually be there to deliver and implement their ideas. That's great, and I think from the civil service point of view, that's fantastic. So I think that's really good. I think civil servants will need to rediscover single party, and some of the things that coalition did that you hadn't expected, like keeping ministers in place for much longer. You know, someone like Vince Cable surviving through things which might otherwise have cost ministers their jobs. That might not be there so much. So I think David Cameron's signalled exactly the right thing, trying to keep as many people in place as possible. And machinery of government changes, I remember him saying very early on, second or third term, you know, not now. And the second or third term comes back to the hubris point, which I would buy were it not for the fact that David Cameron has said, do you know what, I'm going to be different. I'm going to go with the people wanting more, which was a very, very strange thing I thought to do when he did it, but it now I think gives him quite a lot of power in some ways. But obviously, as you approach the end of a parliament, it gets more and more difficult, so I can't quite see him going to the last day somehow. That doesn't make sense to me.
Two things. On the Fixed Term Parliament Act, I mean, there's a very simple amendment which can be done, which is to move from the kind of two fancy things, the 2/3 or 14 days, to a simple majority. So the power still lies with Parliament to call an early election. So it doesn't, and a government has to carry votes in Parliament, but it's a simple majority. That could be done. Admittedly, the review is promised for after the 2020 election. I mean, we have no sight, and nothing has been said so far. It wouldn't entirely surprise me if something happened on that. And I agree that even though it didn't happen, the debate which occurred about what might happen in Home Parliament has thrown up a number of things. Certainly, I know two of us in this room will be looking at those. I see Robert Hazel over there, because he and I will certainly be looking at some of those things. Good. I'm sure whether anyone pays attention is another matter. Can I just make another point, is that one thing which may go on, which affects the civil service, is because of the state of the opposition parties, and because in a sense Scotland's an issue to one side, even though it's a very, very important one, a lot of the functioning of government with the spending review and a lot of the structural changes to government will go on almost without Parliament being involved. I mean, you know, clearly there's going to be a very big changes in the way that services are delivered. To get anywhere near the spending cuts described, there's going to have to be a massive push towards digitalisation of a lot of services. That will occur, but it's almost in a separate compartment from a lot of the conventional political aspects. And there'll be a lot of internal changes in government, and which are very, very important, but it's crucial that they're properly debated and examined.
The one constitutional thing that will, well, you've mentioned Scotland, and you know, whether the Smith Commission is enough or whatever, that will rumble on. But the I think more interesting aspect is going to be English MPs and English laws and how that is actually worked out. And I think that that's going to be the...
How do you do it in the Lords?
Indeed. Is it where we live, where we're born, whatever? But, you know, how is that worked out in practice? It's a very big thing so far as the Conservative Party is concerned. But everybody who's looked at it has come up with many, many problems about which there is not internal party agreement anywhere. And we're now getting more people talking about federalism, federal political parties, you know, an English Labour Party, an English Conservative Party, things of that kind. You know, a lot of these things will be in the churn for now.
Although, of course, English federation laws is irrelevant in the Commons now because the Conservatives have a majority. I mean, actually, curiously, but I mean, I agree.
But they want to
change. Yeah.
They want to make sure.
Yeah, for the future.
For the future.
Yeah.
Okay, I'm going to turn it over to all of you now. Kerry and Lauren have microphones. If you could, Alan is quick off the mark. If you could wait for the microphone and then also identify yourself so we know who you are. Alan.
Thank you. Alan Evans, British Academy and Institute for Government, but prior to that, Director of the Scotland office during the referendum campaign. And I'd like to make 2 points on what the panel said, and they are related. The first one is just to echo what everyone said, but Anne said about the fact that much more business will mean that ministers need to be in the House of Commons. I was Principal Private Secretary between 94 and 97, and the amount of meetings that had to be held in London or in the House of Commons meant that whether or not Parliament was sitting, the threat that something might happen, they'd have to come back, meant that you did lots more business in London. And one of the things I definitely will predict is that civil servants will find themselves stepping in for ministers around the country and overseas at meetings, and it makes you a very unpopular civil servant. I tell you, if you think you're getting a minister and you end up with an official turning up for a meeting. The related point is to pick up what Peter said, and actually to make it even more strongly about Alex Salmon and Charles Stewart Parnell, who not for nothing is Salmon's hero. If people want to do something quite interesting, look at the background and biographies of the 56 members of the SNP elected to the House of Commons. And bear in mind that these are people who do not have great respect for the traditions of the House. Indeed, one of their objectives is to undermine the traditions of the House and everything about it. And I suspect Allard Parnell, but even more strongly, they will do everything possible to undermine the way in which the House works, to disrupt, to cause events, to cause a stir, to get publicity. And their challenge, I think, will be with whether or not they can work together effectively as a unified bloc of 56, or whether they will in some way split and go different ways. I suspect they will work extremely effectively as a unified bloc of 56.
Okay, I'm going to take another question. I'm not sure if there was a question there, but never mind. Robert Hazel there. Anyone else to indicate?
Robert Hazel from the Constitution Unit and the Institute for Government. Can I add a little gloss to what Anne and Gus both said about the House of Lords? Because I think this is a big difference compared with the 1970s and 1990s. Because since the big reform of 1999, when the hereditary peers were removed, the Lords has become much more self-confident and assertive. So after 99, in the 13 years of the Blair and Brown governments, they were defeated in the Commons only 5 times. They were defeated in the Lords almost 500 times. Few people in the room may be aware of that because the media and the lobby correspondents don't write very much about what happens in the Lords. It's been extensively analysed by my colleague Meg Russell, and she looked at all those divisions in the Lords and found that in 9 cases out of 10, it was the Lib Dems what won it or what lost it in terms of whether they voted predominantly for the government or against it. Now, under the coalition for the last 5 years, that Lib Dem group, a pivotal group in the Lords, has been part of the government, and the rate of Lords defeats almost halved under the coalition. But those Lib Dem peers, there are now 100 of them, some 40 or so appointed by David Cameron, are back on the opposition benches. And I think we're going to see quite a lot of action in the House of Lords, particularly on the constitutional issues that Gus mentioned, and civil liberties issues and the like. And that is where I think a lot of the parliamentary opposition to this government may be likely to come from.
Okay. Yeah, go on.
I'd just like to follow that up because as a crossbencher, I mentioned sometimes we're the awkward squad, going to swear in this afternoon at the House of Lords, it's exactly what you said. And I think it's going to get bigger. I think we're going to have more people appointed. To me, it's kind of the analogy is Torremolinos. You know, it's like get up early, get your towel out, and stick it on the seat because otherwise you are not going to get in there. And it's going to be really interesting how this works. We got an email, us crossbenchers today, telling us that we can sit on the other side now because obviously Conservative benches are going to be pretty empty. And the other side, I was thinking I was going to be there with all the Labour, all the 100 Lib Dems who are over there coming over to my bit. And But I think you're right. I think the Lords will be, to use a technical word, very bolshy about some of these constitutional things I said. You know, if there's an attempt to change the boundaries in a way that looks very, very party political, I think there'll be some issues. I think the Unmentioned Human Rights Act, there's a lot of issues there where I wouldn't be surprised if there was quite a lot of ping pong, to use a technical term, going back and forward during this Parliament.
I think there might be quite a lot of ping pong, but I think at the end of the day, the Lords will not stick their necks out too far too often. I think on civil liberties, there's always been a strong resistance in the House of Lords to just rolling over and accepting what the government says. On constitutional issues, yes, to a certain extent. But, you know, Gus said that the crossbenchers are part of the awkward squad. You know, I would say they're not awkward enough. They do actually almost, or some of them, almost think, oh, voted against the government last week, can't do it again, you know. And also, hanging over them, vote too often, and the House of Lords gets too difficult, maybe Lords reform gets back on the agenda. So, you know, there are sort of calming factors as well. So I think the House of Lords will be very strong on a small number of areas, but not universally opposing all that the government's going to do. Although on the other hand, you've got to remember what Peter said, they can actually do an awful lot certainly without primary legislation. And on secondary legislation, the House of Lords' role is very limited indeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it'll be very interesting that if you look at the anti-government votes, they come from two parties which are pledged to reform the Lords in various ways. I mean, not all the actual peers were terribly keen on reform, but the official party lines were for elected, either elected Senate or some version of the Doom proposal of 2012. And also, given the Lib Dems, I think, have an interesting dilemma, given that they always favoured a relationship between numbers of peers and votes cast in an election. Which makes it a bit difficult when you've got nearly 100 peers and only 7% of the vote. I mean, I think it's absolutely certain. I mean, we already saw 8 ministerial peers created last week, 8 or 9. And I think there'll be charabangs full of more by August. Absolutely certain. Of ex-Tory MPs to postal majority. I think it'll be, you know, as both Anne and Gus, I mean, we've identified issues, and I agree with Anne. There'll be a few things where it arises, but and particularly on issues which are mentioned rather than on other issues. There is also, taking up Alan's thing, of course the SNP has always refused peerages. So you've got this interesting phenomenon that the party which has 56 MPs has zero peers. Even the Greens, after all, you know, had the odd peer. And I think it's a very curious asymmetry in the debate. And it's also true that amongst the Labour and Lib Dem peers, they're very strongly unionist too. So it's curious, but certainly going back to one earlier thing, the English votes for English laws thing has not been examined in relation to the House of Lords at all. So what on earth happens on, as you say, is it birth, is it residence? Because the residence thing would have come up if the referendum had gone differently.
Okay, we have 2 questions. Lady here at the front, then 2 questions at the back.
Hi, Sue Street, in my capacity as a non-exec of the Ministry of Justice. I just wondered if some of you or all of you could elucidate a bit the Human Rights Act issues, because it seems to me, if you think about the Lords, you say Europe, Constitution and civil liberties will be the big issues, and that actually encapsulates all of those. It's got a bit of everything in it. And Dominic Grieve today and Melanie Phillips have got some interesting reminders that this is not simple. It's not just about, are you in favour of human rights? Yes. Do you want to be able to export dangerous baddies back to their own countries? Yes. It isn't really that at all. It's far more complicated. And I just sort of wondered if you had some analysis to share with us about what the issues really are.
Come back to that. Yes, yeah.
Thank you. Bob McMullen. I'm a former minister in the Australian government, and as a dual citizen I find this a very bemusing conversation, because in Australia people would kill to have the sort of majority you have here, and certainly throughout Europe people would. I don't understand why people think it's a problem to only have a majority of 12 over a divided opposition. It seems to me to be quite a puzzle. And I also find from my experience that, to pick up I think the point that, if I'm sorry, I think it's Anne made, it's probably a very good thing for governance. The governments that I've seen that have been the worst have been those that have been elected with big majorities, had no significant constraint on their internal irrationalities, and, for example, the Howard government, when it had the unique situation of a majority in the Senate, put through industrial relations laws that destroyed it, because it didn't have that internal discipline of not being able to do just whatever it wanted. And I think probably, while the issues that people are talking about are very important and fascinating to me, I think it's probably a good thing for governance in the UK that you have a government with a small majority.
And yes, in front of you, Lauren. Jeff.
Jeff Rooker, House of Lords. Just a couple of techie points. I think Anne's right that the government won't really have any trouble winning votes in the Commons, but that's not the best place to cause trouble. Because the government's majority now is a lot less than the coalition's majority, it'll only be entitled to one majority on most standing committees. You appoint the wrong person to that standing committee, you're in trouble, as indeed they found out in 1997 when Audrey Wise and I were on the Finance Bill Committee. So that's where the detail... Anne was a boss. She was one of the whips on the committee. But the fact is, that's where the detail will start. And their majority, which they've been used to working with, is big under the coalition. By and large, they're in a new area. They think they've got a majority, and all of a sudden, hang on a minute, we've only got one on this if something goes wrong. The other point is, on the boundaries, I mean, I have to say, by and large, the present boundaries are very unfair to the Conservative Party. I say that, and that, I mean, it's a matter of public record. I think they are. They were unfair to Labour in the 60s. But the boundary changes weren't abandoned. They were delayed for 5 years. And the boundary package means 50 less MPs. Now, it's that where the problem will arise, because I tell you this, when you're elected an MP, you don't like boundary changes. But 50 less means there'll be 50 less seats to go around. And you can't unblock them or unlock those two pieces without a piece of primary legislation. Whereas what was put through a few years ago and delayed can actually be activated without primary legislation. And I think it's that 50 less MPs could be a very telling point from a practical point of view, because it affects the UK. I mean, this is not boundaries for England. This affects the UK. And I think those are two areas where the small majority is a lot smaller than they've been used to working with, and therefore they might come unstuck in some areas.
All right, thanks. Peter, also, I mean, Alan brought up the SNP, you know, possibly newer members not wanting to do things differently. How will they react to select committees? What kind of committees might we see this time round as well?
Well, I mean, I kind of just take up Jeff Rooker's point, which is absolutely correct. I mean, what happens on bill committees will be fascinating. As you say, you know, having a much smaller majority, and the whips have to be extremely careful who they put on. I well remember the Rooker-Wise amendment. It changed tax policy, actually, for the better. It produced a more transparent and honest tax system, particularly at a time of high inflation. And it did. But it was a very interesting example. In league with Nigel Lawson, it was quite interesting. But I think that the point on select committees, I mean, there are lots of rumours that I saw the Sunday papers had on, will they do away with the Scottish committee? Because under the rules of the House, the Tories have be entitled to a majority on the Scottish committee. Well, you know, unfortunately, the only Tory MP north of the border is the Secretary of State. And so this means non-Scot Tory MPs sitting on the Scottish committee, presumably an SNP chairman, Pete Wizard has been mentioned, which ought to be mentioned. And that would just be bizarre. So I think watch this space for the next 2 weeks to see whether there's you have a devolution committee or something like that. So there are lots of issues on that. On the select committees, what happens is, it'll happen next week after the state opening, there's an allocation of committee chairs between the parties, and then they're voted on by the whole House under the post-Tony Wright rules. Now, that allocation means the Lib Dems will get none, but they previously had a couple, and international development and justice. And will those go to the SNP? Which ones will they get? And so there's a very interesting question to be decided on that, and also the makeup, because the SNP will say, well, we're perfectly entitled to 1 or 2 places on every committee. Well, some committees are now doing entirely, look at, say, the Health Committee or Education, look at virtually entirely at English business. So you've got lots of problems there. I agree entirely on that. And Parliament's got to work its way through with a group who won't necessarily be saying, oh, thanks for what's being offered to me. They'll be banging the table much more on that.
Well, I think that's right, and I think it is going to be quite interesting. People are already vying for position within the parties, saying, I'd like the chairmanship of that if we get it, and trying to talk to other parties to do deals, because that's how it was worked out last time. But I think you gave the answer to what a chief whip is likely to do with regard to the Scottish Select Committee, and that is to have one devolution of the regions, and you can make it sound respectable to those who are not nerds, and just wind up the SNP in that. On the boundary package, Jeff's right that it only requires triggering an SI to get that through. But you know, it does mean losing seats, and I've been told that they're already considering actually not triggering those SIs and saying it's 5 years out of date anyway, using that as an excuse for trying to go back to 650 in order to keep everything else calm, because people who think they're going to lose their seat through boundary changes become very unreliable supporters of any government. And speaking of governments and governments with a majority, and Bob at the back, you know, we'd all have killed from any majority, I have to say. European culture is different, but one of the things that we've not mentioned is, because of what happened in the election and the actual result, one of the things that I think we've all seen through, those of us who have been involved in politics for a long time, and I think we're seeing in Europe, is this anti-government, anti-representative democracy, anti-feeling, anti-establishment feeling, which is, you know, I think the SNP capitalises, and I think UKIP capitalised on it. I think the fringe parties, which have suddenly surged forward in Europe, have capitalised on it. And I think that that's one of the issues that all politicians, from all active politicians, mainstream politicians, are going to have to deal with in the future. Jeff was right about committees. But on the other hand, this government is not going to have fantastically large amounts of legislation. It can, when it wants to, put legislation on the floor of the House if it thinks there's going to be a real difficulty in a committee. And you know, when you've got the kind of timetabling or the way the timetabling is used, I don't think that that's as much of a difficulty as it was when you were enjoying yourself.
My guess, for all sorts of reasons, would be that 50 fewer MPs will never happen. It's just one of those things. Exactly, turkeys, yeah. So that's not going to happen. I think on the point our Australian colleague mentioned, I think is a really interesting one, because it is, you know, we were just saying how we've managed coalition, that's different. You know, the world didn't fall apart, so we should be used to all of these different things. And now suddenly we're thinking, oh my God, a small majority, that must be terrible. Actually, you know, for all the reasons I think people have made here, the civil service can adapt to small majorities. They've done it before. Ministers can adapt to it. If, as a net result, we have a more quality and less quantity in legislation, that will be a thoroughly good thing, I'd say. One thing I worry about is after this election, would a small party ever again go in with a big party in coalition? I think that's kind of, so, you know, the line of history is kind of difficult now. So next time round, if we're in a situation like that, would a Lib Dem go in again? Probably not. So what happens then?
Can I just come back to
Sue's point?
Sue's question. Yeah. I think on the Human Rights Act and all that, which I think is very interesting, Michael Gove has reported at the weekend to have said to the staff at the Ministry of Justice some quite saying how difficult the issue was, and this wasn't a straightforward issue. If anything, there's a case for a draft bill, it's that, rather than rushing ahead with a bill, to consult as much as possible, given it is so difficult. And the legal issues are so involved, to produce a draft bill for proper consultation, I think, is the absolute way forward on that.
Okay, questions here at the front. We've got 4 all lined up, so let's take all of them.
Thank you, John Newham. My question is, how will the government survive the European Union referendum, given the very strong views in the Conservative Party, and regardless of the result, regardless of the negotiations beforehand, there could have been an awful lot of very unhappy people with the result? Thank you.
Just pass it to your left.
Hi, Mark MacDonald. Just going to a point that Peter mentioned earlier, just in terms of the getting sort of quite radical legislation through under the Major government. Do you think that's actually possible, just given that it's slightly different in the way that Cameron has set up himself to be unelected next time, and also with the sort of Scottish issue and also the EU referendum? Do you think that with a small majority is going to lead to radical legislation, or is it just going to be more of a business as usual, sort of let's just take it in baby steps?
Andrew?
Andrew Kahn, a governor here at the Institute, but also like Alan Evans, a principal private secretary in the 1990s and then in the Cabinet Secretariat. Just to pick up the point that Anne made about events, looking back on the Major government, the first couple of years were pretty, you know, glad, confident morning. Black Wednesday changed things, and changed things radically. And I think you have to guess what could change the political atmosphere, what could change the sense that this wasn't a powerful, effective administration, but a weak administration, and what would loosen the bounds of party and political loyalty. Because Black Wednesday did that, and I think some unexpected event is the most dangerous thing. The second thing I'd say is that despite that, all the way through, John Major's administration kept on trying to find a solution in Northern Ireland. So a really major constitutional question, which is profoundly important for the country, could nevertheless be taken seriously throughout all the travails, and that did happen. And the third comment I'd make is that things got more and more political for the civil service as that administration went on, because the ministers became more and more political, and one found oneself in more and more uncomfortable positions. And again, I think the civil service may find that happens again, and may need some defences against it.
Tim Bradley, do you think it's possible that, given all these constitutional human rights issues which will be argued about, that one might get to a situation in 2 years' time when it might appear attractive to have a big bang referendum, not just on the EU, but on other constitutional issues? High turnout, almost who governs Britain, Human Rights Act, voting system, and most importantly, the system for the Union. Thank you.
Thank you. We're also coming up to the end of time, I'm afraid, so we'll have to carry on questions outside afterwards. So final thoughts from the panel as well as responses to all of that, so it's not too much for you to do. Gus, do you want to start?
I think referendum on more than the one issue, I think there would be all sorts of reasons why the Prime Minister wouldn't want to do that. So I suspect he'll stick with the EU one and won't go ahead of that. Andrew's point about, you know, what could happen, failed military intervention, being massively behind in the polls, I mean, that would require opposition to sort themselves out. losing the referendum, I think if the Prime Minister loses the referendum, then the point that you were making, then I think we're in completely uncharted territory, because I think that creates all sorts of issues. Because the immediate response will be, well, curious enough, we in Scotland have we're far more interested in being a member of the EU than a member of the UK, thank you very much. We want independence, and so, you know, you get the Cameron legacy not being, I sorted out Europe, I sorted out the Union, being everything fell apart. And I think that does do an enormous amount of damage to party unity, and like I said, I think you get a realignment. I think it's absolutely crucial, which I think is why the EU referendum may turn out to be about far more than just the EU. Indeed. I think we'll go back to our history books for all of that. Absolutely.
Okay. Mark asked about radical legislation. I don't think a majority of 12 stops you having radical legislation, especially, as Peter pointed out, over the main opposition. It's, 90 odd. So I don't think that will stop them. Whether there's an appetite for that or not is another matter, because so many of the big ideas they've got can be done without a lot of radical legislation, because so much legislation that's gone through already, can be implemented with SIs, and a lot can be changed in that way. In terms of Andrew's point about the civil service, I think there is a real danger here about increasing politicisation, and probably, although 15 cabinet members have remained the same, you've got a whole new tranche of Conservative MPs for whom this is the norm, and they are here to implement their views and their manifesto. So their starting point isn't to look back at all to what civil servants have done in the past. It's to demand things of them in the future. And I think that we will see quite a significant change, and possibly some difficult clashes and some interesting points where Cabinet Secretary or others have to intervene. In terms of the EU referendum and its closeness, I think we said earlier that whatever the result, some people won't give up on either side. Whether it becomes a big bang issue, I think there's potential there, but that depends on the nature of the campaign, the nature of the alliances that are worked out in the campaign. It could be that post that we then get to a more thorough and realistic and perhaps frightening discussion about federalism. And if we do go down that route, it could be that would happen, but I can't quite see it within 5 years.
Just a couple of points. One is, I think certainly just one, it'll be a referendum on one issue. If there was a vote no, presumably that would be against the advice of the Prime Minister and Chancellor. And that is cataclysmic. And that would change the nature of politics, it would change the nature of the Union, and so on, and have a massive effect. On the one point I make on radical legislation, I think there's a great danger of, and we've all fallen victim to that, viewing political life as purely being determined by general elections. Policy continues. The majority of policy, 95% of it goes back a long, long time. And it's continuing to be implemented all the time. And even some of the key policy challenges of this Parliament are really all to do, particularly universal credit and the whole welfare, is actually to do with legislation which was passed some years ago. And one shouldn't forget that. That's the biggest challenge there. And in other areas, it won't be a matter of legislation. On defence, for example, it's not going to be a matter of legislation. I mean, there may well be a vote on Trident. Which again could be very significant in relation to the SNP. But the majority of it will not be involving Parliament, or will relate to legislation which occurred sometime in the past. On health, that's also true. On the pace of academies, equally true. It won't be new. And if I put in one final point, in looking at devolution and so on, I do have a concern. And this is a concern I had before the election, that things are looked at in separate compartments. That Scotland and Wales tend to be, all right, they're looked at in a slightly related way. Northern Ireland is already separate, we accept that. But the English question, and I don't mean here English vets or English laws, which is a kind of subset from that, but the Northern Powerhouse, as it's defined by George Osborne, Greg Clark's going to take that further forward, a very interesting appointment. all that is viewed separately. And actually, we need to look at it all connected. Because if we are moving to a quasi-federal structure for the UK, and it will be asymmetrical quite clearly, there needs to be a look at it as a whole, partly for the reason Akash Pan, sitting in the front there, did a very good report, one of our colleagues, Robin Munro, earlier this year, looking at intergovernmental relations. We're not very good at joining the bits up within the UK. And that's increasingly important to join Edinburgh, Cardiff, Belfast, and London all together. And that's a slight worry. It remains rather piecemeal. It actually needs to be looked at not only in the quasi-federal, but also intergovernmental relations. Because what government does is going to mean very different now from what 15 years ago. With Manchester getting powers over health and so on, a health secretary won't have the powers a health secretary had in the past, let alone Scotland and Wales, even within England. These are really big questions which will need to be debated, and I'm not quite sure they are being sufficiently so far.
Thank you. Obviously the first of many debates on all of these issues, I'm sure, over the coming years. Meanwhile, on Friday, Peter mentioned stability. We have a new Minister for the Cabinet Office, Matthew Hancock. He will be here on Friday lunchtime, same time, 12:45 till 2 p.m. The invitations will be going out, we hope, later today for that. And hopefully we'll hear about his views of what the role will mean and how the continuity of civil service reform will be taken on in this government. So keep your eyes out for that. In the meantime, thanks to all of our panel. It's been fascinating, and I hope we continue this discussion anon.